Hey everyone, my name is Susanna Song, and today we welcome you to our Fire Chat IoT Under Siege Cellular Security Strategies That Work. That is a loaded title. So, what does all that mean? Well, I'm glad you're here because we will dissect what that means to the cellular IoT industry as a whole, and what are some of the risks that your business has around, reputation, financial, compliance risks. What does all that mean when it comes to your IoT business? But first, let me introduce you to my panelists, Patty Harrington, Senior Analyst at Forrester, and
Suzanne?
John Connett, Chief Product Officer at Eris.
Hi, Susanna.
Well, welcome, gentlemen. IoT devices are revolutionizing businesses today. The IoT market is expected to grow year over year. Right now, there are about 18 billion IoT connected devices, and according to the latest research, about 25%, about a quarter of those devices are cellular IoT connections. Patty, that number could easily double in the next 5 years. So, from your research at Forrester, what is shaping this growth, this massive growth in cellular IoT?
Yeah, thanks, Susanna. One of the things that we're seeing in our research shows this is in all industries, pretty much, as well as geographies, especially the Americas and EMEA. We're seeing an increase in IoT usage, and there is no decrease going on. There's about 10% who are maintaining what they have, but everyone else that we've polled has said that they're increasing their IoT usage. Now, along with that, what we're also seeing is an increase in 5G utilization by industries. And it's a sizable amount. It's around 66%, give or take, that are increasing their usage of 5G. And this is the respondents that we had in the survey. So you kind of tie those two together, you're seeing a lot more usage of IoT devices and industries. And with that, you'll see the increase in cellular. And I think some of that's really attributed to the fact that businesses are no longer in one fixed building per location. People are everywhere, right? And the business is popping up everywhere. And sometimes having the warehouse attached to the manufacturing location isn't advantageous. So they're distributed. As the businesses get distributed, all the devices get distributed, IoT with that. And as the network connectivity has increased in the cellular space, right? We had, things like LTE and 3G before, but now, 5G is pretty much the standard in so much of the cellular industry. 4G is still here and there, but even with that, there's tons of bandwidth available. So for a lot of these businesses, they look at what's available and say, why do I need this, hardwired connection back to a telco when I can just connect these devices over a cellular connection as I'm adding them? And as you do with laptops and smartphones, you're going to do that too with IoT devices.
And John, with a growing number of IoT devices, I'm assuming bad actors are being opportunistic, and IoT is a growing attack vector.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, of course, is if you think about kind of IT devices in general, things like your corporate laptop, for example, you might have dozens of security tools on that corporate laptop, potentially costing hundreds of dollars a year in terms of the cost of those services. When you shift over to an IoT device, which doesn't necessarily have a user, might not even have a standard operating system, typically you'll have zero security tools, mitigating the risk to that device. And so when you think about it from an attacker's point of view, a device that has no security tooling, has minimal, if any, mitigations in place protecting that device, it's a lot easier to target that device as the entry point into the broader enterprise than, say, again, that laptop or that other more standardized IT device that has more traditional tooling on that device. And so obviously that creates an opportunity for attackers to more easily get into the corporate enterprise. And it also means that a lot of these devices that have either a specific business function, financial in nature, or maybe physical safety in nature, it also means that going after these devices, not only from a security standpoint, are easier, but it can also have an outweighed impact on the business of that enterprise. If you think of like a connected vehicle, for example, if that connected vehicle is compromised, that has a significant financial, regulatory, and brand implication to that manufacturer, right? And so going after those types of cyber physical systems like these IoT devices tend to be means that not only is it easier to attack, but it also has a much more outweighed impact on the enterprise than, say, maybe a more standard laptop or server might have.
What is Forrester, and even your own opinion, like, what is your stance when it comes to IoT and being a growing attack vector?
Starting from the Forrester side, if you will, we've actually had data published for a few years now in our state of IoT security reports, as well as state of endpoint, because IoT devices are just endpoints, right? The last report we did, State of IoT Security 2024, we published that IoT devices, and this is coming from our 2024 security survey, IoT devices were the top target of external attack. Now, what's really depressing with that stat, as we also say in the report, if you look back multiple years, IoT devices have been the top target of external attack for many years now. I think we're at 4. In the 5th year, it was kind of knocked out of first place by the corporate website. So when we think of this, from that aspect, these devices are just becoming this great vector for either private attackers or state-sponsored malicious actors, because they're so prolific. And as John said, that you can't really put your traditional security tools on these devices. Protection has to come in so many different forms. So they're left to their own devices, if you will, and they rely on the security approach that the developer took when they built the device. And if you think back to some of the older IoT devices, ATM machines or printers, you weren't thinking security. Sure, physical security with a bank, but you weren't thinking computer security. So security was an afterthought, if that. Now we've become more security focused, but all these devices that are spread out through so many enterprises, they're not the thing that you bought yesterday, right? They didn't just get a box yesterday from their distributor and just putting them out. Sure, there's some of that, but then you have things that are 5, 10, 50, 20 years old. But before I came to Forrester, I was talking with a customer who had a LaserJet 5 on their network. This device is older than I think some of the analysts who cover these technologies right now. So because of this, they are just primed for attack. And we keep seeing the attacks grow year over year. And it's really scary what's happening in some of these.
Riding along or off of that answer, John, AIR's published recently some alarming statistics that I'm going to show here. Can you expound on what AIR's IoT Watchtower observed in just 1 month? I think you guys were observing about 600,000 cellular IoT devices. What did you see?
Yeah. So this is a couple great stats here. And again, as you mentioned, so this is for, I think, a small subset of around 600,000 devices that we were analyzing and specifically looking for malicious activity. And we were actually quite surprised at how much we saw. So obviously, 600,000 devices. Out of that 600,000, I think one of the most alarming stats that we saw was just the amount of activity going to the dark web. This might not necessarily be an indicator of compromise or attack, but at a minimum, it's a sign of very bad security hygiene. Because, of course, any of that traffic going to the dark web, of course, is unobservable to you, right? So you have no idea what that device is doing or is utilizing or is communicating with. And of course, when you think about things like botnets or command and control servers, those are all typically deployed in the dark web, right? So nothing good happens in the dark web, generally speaking. And so really, as a matter of best practice, you should not have devices communicating to destinations or endpoints in the dark web. And so, of course, if we're seeing 17 million events across 600,000 devices, that's obviously very alarming. And at a minimum, an indicator of really, really bad security hygiene for some subset of those devices. We're also seeing more assertive indicators of compromise. We're seeing clear examples of ATPs. We're seeing a number of actual malicious events, malicious activities, and more specific things like devices communicating with known phishing sites and servers. All of these are a strong indication that this subset of devices, these 600,000 devices, some percent of those devices are being compromised and actively exploited, either for the purpose of external malicious activity as part of a botnet, or for the purpose of exploiting the enterprise for which those devices belong. So very, very concerning stats. And I think one that really exemplifies the fact that, again, IoT, it's that kind of soft underbelly of the enterprise. And you don't typically think of these devices as your attack surface commonly. And I think that kind of gap in thinking is why, as Patty mentioned, we see IoT as an increasingly one of the largest vectors of attack for external threats.
Are you surprised by the stats that Watchtower observed?
One of the things when you think about IoT, right, and John mentioned this, you don't think of it as an attack vector because of what it is. It's an IoT device, and if you expound on that and think, sure, laptop, that's where the user works day in, day out. I want the data that's there. The smartphone, they have all these local apps that connect to all these resources. I want to compromise that to get to the resources. An IoT device, it's a scale. It's a blood pressure monitor, right? It's a car. What data am I going to get out of that? And a lot of people just put that in their head and they downplay it. But, to one of the points he mentioned, a key thing that is being used with the IoT device is the lateral movement. Because the protection is so low on these devices, I get into that device, I can now get into the rest of your network, and I can contact my dark website, pull down reconnaissance tools that I can run on this IoT device and probe all the soft spots in your network. I can find that test network where you have wide open devices, get in there and do some real damage to the rest of the network. And, this just continues to increase. And I think one of the things that scared me lately is we talked about IoT botnets before, and, I've published blogs and stuff about it. Some of the latest botnets, they're not just doing a DDoS attack, right? They're not just slamming a site to bring it down. They're delivering malware. And this is a new trend that's really starting to scare me. There was something that happened within this last week that Cloudflare picked up 5 terabytes of throughput at peak at one of these attacks. And these are numbers that are unheard of. This has never happened before, So this is starting to get scary for enterprises, and I don't think it's going to slow down until the proper security tools are put in place.
Any predictions on when we will see the next massive cellular IoT breach?
Yeah, this year. So, every year Forrester does the predictions across the various teams in cybersecurity and risk. IoT security breach was chosen by the team as one of the most probable predictions. And I think it's because of all those things that we've talked about so far, right? We've essentially ignored the security. Now, I'm generalizing. Obviously, there's tons of enterprises who do it right, but we've generally ignored security. We have such a range of devices between old and new, small and large, things running proprietary OS, things running Windows XP. If they're lucky, it's XP. It could be even 2000. You have so many vectors of attack that are out there in this space. And as I was talking about those botnets, there was a vulnerability released last year, or publicly announced, for a particular camera type. And the manufacturer said, we can't fix this because it's out of support. It's a 6-year-old vulnerability. We never patched it because we didn't discover it. Well, it's now too late. We can't patch it. The attackers, once they found that, they started to use those, right, in their botnets and other things like that. So the attacks, once the vulnerability is discovered, the attack goes on. And if you take that into this world that you talk about in cellular IoT, think of that in some of the devices that are out there. Healthcare, there's tons. If we take something like a CPAP machine, the amount of people globally who use CPAPs, never mind within particular regions, millions upon millions, if not hundreds of millions. Well, if a compromise is found in a Philips or ResMed, Respironics, whatever, millions of people are affected. And if you don't patch that right away, the attackers are going to find it and compromise it. And sure, okay, what are they going to get? They're going to get data, or they're going to be malicious. And when we talk healthcare and malicious action, it's never a pretty picture. You talk transportation and malicious action. The vulnerability last year with the recording devices, right, for the truckers that are built into the machine, they're built into the vehicle, they're hardwired. If that's compromised, and again, the compromise is wide enough, you can start controlling that vehicle. And that's scary. And this is why I think this attack of scale is probably going to happen in 2025, because there's so much out there to be compromised. And all it takes is one vulnerability and the attackers to say, that looks good to me. I'm hoping it's minor, and I know this is going to sound bad. I'm hoping it's just data theft. But, it could go anywhere.
I love how you bring it down to real life situations, because especially in the healthcare, medical device industry, it is life and death, right?
Yeah.
John, I'm thinking about the naysayers here. There are a lot of businesses saying, I'm okay. My devices are secure. I've got encryption. I've got VPN. I have APN. I have my corporate IT security, and I've got the whole MDR. Or XDR now. I'm covered. What would you say to that when it comes to their cellular IoT devices?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's a number of different misconceptions out there that are lending to this kind of growing risk, particularly when it comes to cellular connected devices. So just stating the obvious, unlike within the wired network within an enterprise, a cellular connected device is really outside of the control of the enterprise, right? It's networked via a third party, a telco. In most cases, it's physically outside of your control, right? It's in the wild somewhere. It's a car driving down the road. It's a smart meter that's connected to your customer site, which you don't necessarily have physical access to. Right. And all of these present constraints in terms of your ability to control and secure those devices. And I think there's been a common misconception that, the telco manages the connectivity, and therefore it's secure, right? The telco's secure. Well, let's just look at the newspaper over the last couple of months, and we see major breaches of operator networks, with the Salt Typhoon attack being a perfect example. So severe that the U.S. federal government is telling employees not to use their phones to communicate, do government business. These environments are not secure. They weren't designed, for the types of security risks and challenges that we have today. These are networks that were designed years and years ago, right, before the prevalence of these cyber threats really became commonplace, right? And so the challenge then becomes, you don't control the network. You don't physically control the device, and the network itself potentially is compromised. And oh, by the way, if you're deploying across a global IoT program across many different physical geographies, now you potentially have multiple carriers that you have to deal with that have differing risks and security implications, right? So when it comes to IoT and when it comes to cellular IoT, just the confluence of challenges that you're going to run into are so vast that it really puts a strong emphasis on the need to really mitigate this risk somehow. And if I can write on one of the statements that Patty made, these are cyber physical systems, right? It's not just stealing data. There is a potential impact in the real world when compromising these devices, even devices as simple as like a smart meter, right, on the electric grid. You might say, well, it's just reading data on electric uses. Well, it's actually been proven by researchers with the U.S. federal government that by manipulating the data coming out of smart meters in aggregate, you can actually create outages, brownouts of the electrical grid by basically exploiting the way that power utilities manage their grid. By sending a bunch of false information, you can basically cause an outage. So even sensors, right, basic devices that you would not otherwise think of as not really an issue, from certainly a data theft standpoint, or certainly from a physical risk standpoint, actually can have really significant outweigh risk, much greater and beyond the cost or the value of the device itself.
To add that was a great answer, John. Anything else to add, Patty, to what John said?
He pretty much covered it. I think that from my side, one of the things I also think of is no device is perfectly secure. You could be updating any platform per minute. A vulnerability is going to be uncovered somewhere by someone and not be patched for a period of time. It's just the nature of the beast. Take cars. People think of a car, a connected vehicle. Car, it doesn't matter. Car, plane, boat, drone, connected vehicle as an IoT device. But it's not. It's a network of IoT devices because of all the sensors and other components inside. So let's say, the sensor manufacturer for the brake servo discovered a vulnerability. It's going to take them months to release a patch for that because they have to determine what's the impact. Is it all of our sensors? Is it only one? They have to go through such a process to determine how to patch this, get it to that vehicle's OEM, right? Whoever built the car itself. They then have to make sure of what vehicles it's going to impact. I could go on. It's going to take months for that patch to be deployed. All the attacker has to know of, this vulnerability is available. Here we go. I get to go and try and find a way to compromise it. So this is the problem of it's going to be secure. It's not. And that's why in IT in general, we have lines of defense. If you're not doing that same thing with your IoT devices and you're just relying on device security or maybe just network security, no. It's so many components that have to envelop this to make sure that you're protected. And even then, if someone is really dedicated, they're going to get through.
Yeah, I like that. Lines of defense, layers of defense. We're not saying you don't use APN VPNs, right? Like you should still have a strategy around what your security is, but it's having what would we say, like the defense in depth or layers of defense. I want to move this webinar along because I'm curious. There are tools out there where a business can actually see what their IoT devices are doing. I always wonder though, like if businesses know their anomalies, even something like data overage, are they actually equipped then to take action? Because it's one thing to know versus actually taking action, especially when the repercussions of shutting down an IoT device is costly. And in some cases, to your point, Patty, can be deadly. So John, is there a way to pinpoint suspicious activity down to the IoT device and can you just block the data without turning the device off? Because I would think that would be a huge operational issue for companies if they have to actually shut down the device.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would start off with, of course, that all security starts with visibility, right? You can't secure what you can't see. So if you don't know if something exists and you don't know what it's doing, it's basically a black hole. You might as well have a screen door on your submarine, right? It's for you, it's basically just an unknown risk, right? Then, of course, and there's lots of great tools out there that can give you that visibility, right? Because everybody kind of understands that precept that you really need to know. You need to have your hardware asset inventory. You got to know all your devices, and you need to have your software asset inventory. You got to know what's running on those devices and what they're doing, right? Vulnerabilities, et cetera. The next step comes with what you just said, which is, okay, so you've got the visibility. Now, what do you do about it? Let's say you actually see some type of compromise, or maybe just an anomaly that would be potentially indicative of some type of either malicious or non-malicious. Either way, you want to do something about it. Well, as you mentioned, just turning the device off, just blocking it, that can have some serious repercussions. A great example would be a connected vehicle, right? Lots of the services of that connected vehicle require connectivity. E-call being a great example. The car's in a crash, the car automatically phones to a back-end service that says, "Hey, vehicle's in crash. Notify emergency services." Right? If you cut off the connectivity of the vehicle, you've now cut off that essential service. There's lots of examples like this. So you really need to have much more granularity in terms of your control around what that device can do to make sure that you're not only limiting the blast radius of any potential threat, but also not cutting off critical services for, again, a device that could have life and safety related repercussions. So, having your controls in place in a way that are granular, being able to have that pervasive visibility so that when that device is doing something wrong, you can actually do something about it. And then, of course, integrating that into your broader incident response process is, of course, critical to mitigating any threat that potentially is propagating in your environment.
For the both of you, what are some best practices and guidelines for our viewers and our listeners today to navigate the security space when it comes to their IoT device?
Yeah, so just expounding on my previous answer. So, there's lots of standards and recommendations out there when it comes to what I would call like security controls or critical controls. The same controls that apply for your IT environment, your wired environment, you should really think about applying to your IoT environment, right? So again, hardware and software asset inventory, know what you have, right? Knowing what you have is kind of like your first layer of defense. You would be shocked at how many companies, particularly in IoT, particularly in cellular IoT, have no idea what devices they have, how many they have, where they are, or certainly what they're doing, right? Once you have that basic level of information, then there's an escalating level of insight that you want to have in order to, one, just have really good proactive defense, right, to prevent malicious activity, and then, of course, be able to respond appropriately when inappropriate or malicious activity is happening. So taking all those same kind of critical controls and processes and best practices that you have in the IT world and applying that to the IoT world, whether cellular or not, I think is really the best practice out there for any service or enterprise that is trying to mitigate the risk for themselves or their customers.
To add on to that a little bit, I think where people can fall down with IoT is there are some things that you do in the general IT space dealing with your traditional endpoints and mobile where they forget with IoT. Like a common one is when you push out proxy settings or secure web gateway, as we tend to call it now, to your user interactive devices. You forget that your IoT devices generally don't have that capability. Right? You don't deliver proxy settings to these. So as John was talking about earlier, right, these IoT devices, even cellular IoT devices going to dark websites. Well, hold on. You didn't put those same barriers in place to limit where these devices could access. So old-fashioned, I've been around for long enough, network access control policies that say these IoT devices, whether they're inside the enterprise or external, can only talk to these destinations. And across that cellular link, they can only talk to this site for my business and this site for the manufacturer. Anything else, dead. right? Because that'll limit, if someone can physically get to that, especially these cellular IoT devices, I can physically connect to it, whether I'm plugging in through USB or I actually just rip the thing open there, right? I've seen that happen with EV chargers or something, scary stuff. Um, they can only get to the corporate site. Okay, problems can exist, but you've got enough defenses, or the manufacturer. Because you've controlled the network along the way, it can't get anywhere else. You know, so I think John is definitely hitting it perfectly. You take the same principles that you do for anything else in your enterprise, and then reading some of the other guidance and specifications out there from NIST, NISA, CISA. There's a couple others out there that do some great work that contact we can talk about, but apply the additional things that narrow down to your kind of IoT devices, whether it's healthcare, manufacturing, transportation, finance. You can then whittle it down to those specific things. So start with the principles and then get fine.
It sounds like you're describing like a zero trust framework.
Yep.
Is there even a possibility for businesses to incorporate that, John?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, zero trust obviously very a lot of hype around zero trust. But Patty actually mentioned something very critical that's unique to IoT that actually makes zero trust relatively practical. Um, Zero trust, conceptually, when you think about a user-centric device, there's a lot of different vectors that you have to consider, right? Like zero trust to the application, zero trust to the device, zero trust for the user. Like what can the user access? What applications are accessible? Other devices, et cetera. When it comes to IoT, it's actually much easier and much more simplistic. These IoT tend to be fixed function devices, right? Cyber physical in nature in most cases. And you should know, based on the function and the use case of the device, what applications and services it should be able to communicate, right? So that usually means being able to communicate back to the corporate enterprise, the corporate network, maybe a specific application that's unique to that device, and maybe the manufacturer, right? And so you should be able to put in place proactive controls that limit or block, as Patty mentioned, from a network standpoint. And I come from the network access control space, so I'm very familiar with this concept. But putting those proactive controls in place, you can effectively create a zero trust environment specific to your IoT program. Now, of course, the challenge comes with this is that this assumes that you know what your device should and should not be doing. And the reality is that it's actually much more complex. And not to get in too deep, but the challenge that you have here is that for many of these devices, the device manufacturer or the OEM is really just an assembler, right? They are taking off-the-shelf components from a variety of other sources and manufacturers and assembling that together to create that device. Well, the challenge becomes if somewhere down that supply chain, one of those manufacturers, or maybe it's even a software stack, an open source software stack that the device OEM is using, has some embedded code or some embedded hardware that allows it to phone home, that can, one, break the device if it's not allowed to reach out and get that firmware update that it needs, or two, create an unknown backdoor into the device that then allows either a method of compromise or, as I mentioned before, creates a challenge in terms of setting up the mitigating controls to enforce a zero trust type of framework. And of course, that's why we have all sorts of new rules and regulations around software and hardware bill of materials. But as you can see, it can get really, really complicated if you don't have the combination of real-time visibility into what the device is doing, combined with the granular enforcement to actually enact those types of zero trust policies.
We discussed a lot here. It's a lot to digest. But some final thoughts from the both of you guys as we wrap this very insightful Fire Chat webinar. What would you say? Maybe, Patty, I'll start with you. It could be a recommendation. It could be just kind of your last kind of thought, insight for today.
If you haven't started down this path yet of protecting your IoT devices inside or outside of your enterprise, right? So whether they're on your wire, your local wireless, or your cellular, do it now. You don't have time to wait and think about it. The attacks are coming, and they are going to find you. This is not a area of security that you can put off any longer, because the attackers are not slowing down. I hate to be doom and gloom, which if you've seen my LinkedIn, I tend to be a little doomy about it. But it's only because the threats are going to try and compromise your business, and we don't want to see that.
Yeah, I guess the point I would end with is, the IoT ecosystem is complex. Unlike in the sort of traditional IT space where the enterprise has full control over the environment and therefore full control and responsibility over mitigating the risk. The reality is in the IoT world, it's going to be a combination of different actors and players, everyone from the telco operator who's actually managing the network to the device manufacturer who's selling and delivering the device, and then maybe the application service provider who is enabling the IoT program on behalf of the enterprise customer. Everybody has to play their part, and unfortunately, that means everybody needs to be thinking about security, from device to connectivity to actual application and operations.
Well, no doubt IoT security is paramount. Thank you both, Patty and John, and to all of our attendees and viewers around the world. If you have any questions for either of them, please send us an email, reach out to us. We're more than happy to elaborate and bring you resources that will help you along this journey.